Hi, this is Dustin Mattison. I'd like to share my analysis of Pierre's Play the Game presentation, looking at it from the lens of how do we use an asset-based, bias-aware assessment to look at the value of student work. So how do we assess this work done by Pierre? Pierre's core thesis was a call for self-growth. He created a metaphor using the game of Monopoly as the metaphor, and he did a synthesis of logic, emotion, and lived experience. For example, we can look at the use of cultural and personal assets. He used Pierre, he used Drake as an example. He said, let's take Drake for an example. Drake dropped out of high school with 6 credits left, and now look at him. I want to be like Drake. From this, we can see that Pierre is connecting with his target audience, which is grade 9 students, and he was using culturally relevant examples that reflect youth culture and identity. He used humor, he used music and metaphor effectively. The next thing we could look at is low inference observation. So when we make observations, try to keep it low inference. Be neutral and objective. So for example, he uses the metaphor, high school is like a board game. That's a neutral, descriptive observation about something that he did in his work. And that's something that I applied in my analysis of an assessment of his work. Then we have the knowledge structures theory. This theory looks at how the student organizes knowledge. And what I found was that look at the example of when he talked about applying for a job, and the people that he interviewed with didn't ask him about his school or about his scores in his classes. They wanted to know if he could articulate himself. So what Pierre was doing here was organizing his knowledge, not around academic and about what he's doing in school, but the real world relevance to living in the world and how to be successful. He avoided rigid thinking. He connected his personal experiences to a bigger idea of finding a job. And it followed a clear logic. Okay, then we have the cognitive development perspective, where we look at the reasoning versus just the formal correctness, and we reward complex thinking. So Pierre talked about dropping out of high school. Drake dropped out of high school. He says this is not likely to happen. You're not going to become a famous pop star because Drake did. This demonstrates Pierre's early contextual relativism. Meaning he's looking at different paths. He's analyzing different choices, and he comes up with a reasoned conclusion. So that shows some of his development in reasoning abilities. In his reasoning abilities. Ethical reasoning. He's looking at the context. Showing awareness of multiple perspectives. He's somewhat moving away from black and white thinking. Though he does mention black and white. That was a little bit the black and white metaphor that he brought up. Then we have the cultural development theory. Here we can look at the example of when he talks about looking at Obama's he says he wants to learn how to speak confidently. He says he wants to learn how to speak confidently. This shows that the student is showing some adaptation. He's showing some adaptation. Cultural modeling with his personal growth. This is a way to honor multiple knowledge systems and mentors. He's demonstrating intercultural awareness. And he's using a culturally familiar language and tone in his speech. Okay, then we have the formative growth. When we give feedback, we should build on the student's strengths and push for deeper reflection. Is the student demonstrating readiness? Is he showing evidence of self-driven? Is he showing evidence of self-driven reflecting on his learning? One example from his learning speech is one example from his. He didn't take a class. He just read between the lines and practiced. He just read between the lines and practiced on his own. This does not show a lack of respect for academics, but in respect rather it shows his initiative and reflective. Rather it shows his initiative and reflective learning, and his showing his readiness to be an adult, taking responsibility, to be an adult taking responsibility, and striving for personal growth. Okay, then there's something AI. This is something I added. Then there's something AI. This is something I added. Students objectively. How to assess I used students AI for my analysis, and I think this is a good AI for my analysis, and I think to add to the practice. Basically, what I did is I did the analysis. Basically, what I did is I did the analysis using any AI on my own. But then I used AI after that to analyze. But then I used AI after that to analyze using the frameworks that we learned in this to help unit to add an additional objective perspective. To add an additional AI provided some additional insights that I couldn't provided some additional insights that I couldn't see. This could be used as a behind the scenes. This could be used as a behind the scenes tool to detect biases that the teacher may not be aware of. That the teacher may not be aware of. I thought it was very useful. Student-centered rubrics. Okay, student-centered. So the rubric should also be student-centered. So the rubric should also be student-centered. Identity development. Align the scoring with the student's identity development. So the rubric that was provided in this. So the case study. The rubric that was provided in this. Not this case study. Adequate wasn't student-centered. Adequate as well as it wasn't student-centered as well as it should have. Trying to allow for non-traditional expression. Trying to allow for non-traditional honoring the student's intention and the student's voice. Honoring the student's intention and the student's voice. So the assessment should measure the ability of the student to craft. So the assessment should measure the ability of the student to craft a coherent, not to penalize the student for not using academic vocabulary. Not to penalize the student. So the student used a lot of academic colloquial language. So the student used a lot of colloquial language for the target audience, which I thought was a very appropriate for the target audience. Did not value those areas. The teacher assessing that student. So I think a student-centered rubric would have helped those areas. Provide a more objective. So I think a student-centered rubric would have helped for the student. Provide a more objective. So I gave the student the highest for the marks using the rubric. So I gave the student the highest mark. The teacher using the rubric gave very low marks. Whereas and I think if the teacher would have followed this gave very low marks. Just outlined. And I think if the teacher would have followed this would have been much more that I just outlined. Fair. The assessment would have been much more focusing on student growth rather than growth oriented, rigid, focusing on student growth rather than thank you. Rigid academic frameworks. Thank you. And now I'd like to share a podcast I created using Notebook LM. The title is The Value of Student Work Using an Asset-Based Bias-Aware Assessment.
We often glance at student work, and our eyes just go straight to the grade, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Almost automatic. Yeah.
But you've shared some really interesting sources with us that, well, they make you wonder. What if that grade is just scratching the surface?
Right. What if there's a whole lot more going on underneath? Potential and understanding we're missing.
Exactly. You've given us articles looking into how we actually analyze student work and maybe more importantly, how we can try to look past our own assumptions when we're evaluating it.
Yeah.
So that's our focus today, really, to dive deep into these ideas and figure out how we can truly see the learning that's happening, beyond those first quick judgments.
Absolutely. And the material you've got, it ranges from research articles to reflections on actual classroom practices and even a student's own video presentation. It gives us a really rich picture.
That's great.
We're not just talking theory here. We're looking at real situations and practical ways to approach assessment.
Good. Because I think for anyone involved in learning, maybe as an educator, or maybe just someone curious about how we all develop, the big question is, how do we look beyond the obvious? How do we really get a sense of someone's understanding their potential, find those hidden strengths?
Yeah, that's the core challenge.
Okay, let's unpack this then. One of the first things that struck me reading that piece, minimizing bias when assessing student work, is just how subtle our own biases can be, sneaky almost.
Oh, definitely. We think we're being objective, but there are so many unconscious things pulling the strings.
And what's interesting, as the authors point out, is that it's not necessarily like malicious or deliberate.
Not at all. We all naturally lean towards info that confirms what we already think. That's just how brains work.
Confirmation bias.
Right. And we have these ingrained attitudes, could be about someone's background, their communication style, maybe even just whether they agree with us, that can unconsciously color how we see their work.
Yeah, and you can really picture how that plays out when you're looking at student work. The article gives some really relatable examples, like the one where a student presents an argument that flat out challenges the instructor's own view.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost instinctive, isn't it? To maybe scrutinize that a bit more closely, even if you're trying really hard not to.
That's a huge one. How do you consciously separate your opinion on the topic from your evaluation of their reasoning? That's tricky.
It really is.
And the article also mentions how different people can have totally different takes on the same piece of work, especially if it's about something sensitive or controversial.
Right. Which just shows how much our own individual viewpoints shape what we see.
Exactly. So just knowing we might have these biases, well, it isn't really enough, is it?
No, not really. The article is pretty clear. We need actual strategies, like concrete ways to look at work that help keep those influences in check.
And that brings us nicely to those 3 theoretical frameworks that Steinken and Fitch talk about.
Okay, yeah, those were interesting.
They offer a really valuable way to shift our focus. Instead of looking mainly at what the student is saying, which is often where our biases sneak in,
Right.
they guide us to look at the underlying structure of their thinking.
Okay, structure over content, in a way.
Sort of. The first framework is rooted in cognitive structures, developmental theories.
All right, cognitive structures. So this is about recognizing that how someone reasons, how they understand complex stuff, it isn't fixed. It develops over time.
Precisely. They mention thinkers like Perry, Kohlberg, Bennett, people who mapped out stages of intellectual growth.
Okay.
So the core idea is that learning isn't just about piling up facts, it's a journey towards more sophisticated ways of thinking.
Makes sense.
So when we look at student work through this lens, we're asking, where are they on that path? Are they moving from simpler, maybe more black and white thinking towards something more nuanced, something that acknowledges complexity, different viewpoints?
Got it. And the minimizing bias article had a great example about students analyzing why people tend to blame parents for how kids turn out.
Yes, that illustrated it perfectly.
You could really see the difference between a maybe less developed response, just saying kids blame their parents, versus one that brought in social factors, the media, maybe the school system.
Exactly. That more complex response shows deeper cognitive processing. It's not just one cause, it's seeing a whole web of things interacting.
Right.
And the key insight for bias reduction here is seeing learning as developmental helps us value progress in reasoning. We're looking for evidence of that journey, not just the final answer matching our expected answer.
Okay, that's powerful. Valuing the journey. Then framework number 2, knowledge structures.
Right. This one shifts the focus a bit. Less about developmental stages, more about how students actually organize and connect the knowledge they have.
How they put the pieces together.
Yeah, exactly. The emphasis is on coherence. Does it hang together logically? Not just the specific facts, but how they're linked. They mention Gracer and Clark, Schenck. What's key here is spotting how a student builds their explanation. Is it just a list of points, maybe disconnected? Or does it flow? Do they show meaningful connections between ideas?
Like in that same example about blaming parents. You might see just a list of reasons versus an explanation that actually builds a kind of narrative showing cause and effect.
Precisely. Like the student who points out that society often looks for origins, so parents become the obvious target. That shows an understanding of a broader pattern.
Yeah, connecting the specific issue to a bigger idea.
So the insight here for minimizing bias is focus on the coherence, the logical flow. You're assessing their grasp of relationships between ideas, not just isolated facts, which can be less subjective.
Okay, makes sense. And the third one, argument structures.
This one comes more from the English discipline, actually. Graff and Birkenstein's they say, I say idea.
Oh, right. I remember that. The idea that strong arguments are always kind of responding to other arguments. They don't just exist on their own.
Exactly. It's about seeing if the student understands that whatever they're arguing is part of a bigger conversation, that there are other viewpoints out there.
So you're looking for whether they acknowledge what other sources say before presenting their own take, the I say.
That's the core of it. The example they used about standardized tests showed this well. You see the student acknowledging arguments against tests, they say, before putting forward their own stance and explaining how it fits in or pushes back.
Okay, so it's about showing awareness of the landscape of the discussion.
Yes, and positioning their own ideas within that context, the bias reduction insight. By looking at how they engage with other views, we assess their understanding of academic conversation, not just whether we personally agree with their conclusion. Helps keep our own opinions at bay.
Okay, these three frameworks, cognitive, knowledge, argument structures, seem like really solid ways to analyze the thinking behind the work. But you also shared some stuff that felt more, I don't know, hands-on, this asset-based assessment idea.
Yes. That's a really important complementary approach. It shifts the focus deliberately.
How so?
Instead of starting by looking for problems or deficits, you actively look for what students can do. What are their strengths? What assets do they bring to the table?
I like that, focusing on the positive first. The asset-based analysis and asset-based bias-aware assessment pieces really dug into this.
They did. And a key tool they talk about is using low-inference notes.
Low inference.
Yeah.
Meaning just sticking to the facts.
Exactly. Pure observation. You record exactly what you see or hear in the student's work, written, spoken, whatever, without adding your interpretation or judgment right away.
Okay, give me an example.
So instead of writing like the metaphor is confusing, which is high inference, your judgment.
Right.
You just write, student used the metaphor. High school's like a board game, period. Just what happened.
Got it. That forces you to separate observation from judgment. It makes so much sense.
It really does. And then those sources lay out this protocol, analyzing for assets, which builds right on those objective notes.
Okay, what does that involve?
It's a structured process. You start with those low inference notes, then you identify specific strengths you observed, then you think about areas for potential growth.
Okay.
But then, crucially, you identify the assets the student brings, maybe cultural knowledge, personal experiences, community connections, unique skills.
So broadening the idea of strengths.
Yes. And finally, you develop a plan to support their learning that actually leverages those assets.
Wow, okay. That feels really constructive.
Yeah.
And we have that case study of Pierre Jones and his play the game video speech to see it in action.
Yes, Pierre's video is such a fantastic illustration. He's a high school senior talking to ninth graders, right?
Yeah, tackling that big question, is high school really necessary? And he uses this great analogy of it being a game.
And he weaves in stuff that connects with his audience, Drake, Obama references.
Right, humor, music. It's really dynamic.
It is. And the sources give us some of those actual low inference notes taken during his presentation. Things like, opened with rhetorical question, Riza City of high school. Use Drake as example role model. Metaphor. High school is like a board game. Shared personal experiences navigating HS. Just observations.
Okay, just the facts. And from those, you start seeing the strengths.
Exactly. You can see the clarity of his main message. He uses an engaging hook. The speech has a clear beginning, middle, end structure. And his author's craft, how he uses rhetoric, stories, even the video editing, it's pretty effective for getting his point across.
Definitely. But the analysis wasn't just positive, right? It also pointed out areas for growth.
Absolutely. Like maybe connecting that game metaphor more explicitly to real-world consequences if you don't play, or clarifying a point he made about things not being black and white.
Okay, and that's crucial, isn't it? Asset-based doesn't mean ignoring weaknesses.
Not at all. It means framing those areas for growth within the context of the strengths you've already identified. It changes the conversation.
Yeah, it feels more supportive.
And then comes the focus on assets. The analysis points out Pierre's cultural capital referencing Drake and Obama. That lands with his peers.
Totally.
His involvement in activities outside class, community meetings that shows engagement, a wider view.
Right.
And the fact that he looked up how Obama speaks to learn from him, that shows real initiative, self-driven learning. That's a huge asset.
It really is. And it's fascinating how you can then layer those theoretical frameworks we talked about onto Pierre's work too.
Yes. Thinking about cognitive development, you see him moving beyond maybe just a simple get famous like Drake idea towards a more complex understanding of navigating the rules of the high school game for future success.
Yeah, a more strategic view.
And culturally.
Well, his use of those specific figures, Drake and Obama, and his colloquial language, it shows he knows how to connect with his audience using shared cultural references effectively.
Definitely speaking their language.
Yeah.
And knowledge structures. He seems to be organizing his understanding around practical relevance. What parts of high school actually matter for the real world, for jobs, for how you present yourself? not just abstract academic stuff.
Which is a valid way to structure knowledge, even if it's not purely academic.
Exactly. Which then brings us back to potential bias in how his work might have been initially assessed.
Right. The summaries suggested maybe lower ratings on things like presentation or style.
Yeah, possibly reflecting a bias against his less traditional, more culturally specific approach. Maybe it didn't fit a standard mold of a good academic presentation.
It really highlights how easily we can undervalue work that doesn't match our expectations, even unconsciously.
But applying that asset-based lens helps you re-see it. You recognize the value in his authentic voice, the cultural connection, the real-world focus.
Yeah. And once you think about creating like student-centered rubrics that actually value different kinds of reasoning and expression.
Precisely. And those reflection questions included in the resources you shared also feed into this.
Oh yeah, the ones about learning support and feedback.
They really emphasize breaking tasks down, giving objective, specific feedback.
And focusing on revision as part of learning, not just judging the final thing.
Yes, which ties directly back to how we can support all learners better. Focusing on process, identifying specific things to work on without judgment.
And then there was that really powerful reflection on our own biases, the personal stories shared in the source about experiences with wealth, power, culture.
That was striking, wasn't it? How those background factors can unconsciously shape our perceptions of others.
It really makes you stop and think.
And what's so important there is just acknowledging it. Recognizing these tendencies exist in us is the absolute first step towards fairer practice. It's ongoing work.
Definitely. It's a constant check-in we need to do.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the sources even briefly mentioned AI potentially helping with this.
Yeah, just a touch. The idea that AI might be able to spot patterns or give low-inference summaries, maybe help flag where our own judgments might be creeping in?
Like a tool to increase our own awareness.
Possibly. It's definitely an area that's evolving, but the potential for AI to act as a kind of objective first look or highlight inconsistencies is, well, something to keep an eye on.
Okay, so bringing this all together,
Yeah.
the big takeaway for me, really, is that if we want to genuinely understand learning and potential, we have to look deeper than the grade, deeper than that first impression.
Absolutely.
By using these frameworks, the thinking about cognitive growth, how knowledge is structured, how arguments are built, and by actively adopting that asset-based mindset.
We can get a much richer, much more accurate picture of what someone truly knows and can do.
Yeah. It's about consciously shifting our focus, isn't it? From hunting for deficits to actively seeking out the diverse strengths and the developing reasoning people bring.
That's it, exactly.
So here's a final thought, maybe something to mull over. Think about a time, could be recently, could be ages ago, doesn't have to be school when you made a quick judgment about someone's work, or maybe just their ideas. Now, how might applying these lenses change that initial perspective? If you thought about their underlying reasoning, how they structured their thoughts, if you actively look for their strengths, their assets, what might you have seen differently?
Yeah. What hidden skills or developing ideas might you have missed?
Right. It's just recognizing that understanding isn't one single thing. It shows up in so many different ways.
And by actively looking for those diverse ways, we don't just become fair evaluators.
We also create more space for growth.
Exactly. We can foster that growth and truly recognize the incredible potential that's there in all sorts of learners and thinkers.
We really hope you'll explore these ideas further, maybe check out some of the concepts that resonated from this deep dive. Think about how they might apply in your own world.
Because ultimately, getting beyond those surface judgments, it just lets us see people and their potential much more clearly, much more deeply.